The sky didn't just break, it tore itself apart. One moment, Joanna Tucker was staring out at a sky the color of a bad bruise. The next, the world was screaming. A sound like 1,000 freight trains derailing at once, a roar so deep it vibrated in her bones, in her teeth. The tornado didn't just pass by her homestead. It ate it. The house her father had built with his own 2 hands, the one she was born in, just exploded into 1,000,000 splinters. The barn vanished. The world turned into a brown and gray blur of violence. And then, silence. A silence that was louder than the storm itself. Joanna was on her knees, though she didn't remember falling. Her dress was ripped. A hot sting of pain throbbed at her temple. And where her home used to be, there was just nothing. A flat, ugly scar on the face of the prairie. Her parents were in Topeka visiting her aunt. A small mercy in an ocean of loss. But she had been there. She had seen the end of her world. She pushed herself to her feet and just started walking, away from the splinters and the silence. She didn't have a destination. There was nowhere to go. Her feet were bare. The ground was cold, and the sun, the damned sun, was shining again like it hadn't just watched her life get erased from the earth. She walked until her legs gave out, and she collapsed in the middle of the endless grass, shivering. That's where he found her. A rider coming over the rise, tall and broad, silhouetted against that mocking sun. He rode like he was part of the horse and dismounted in a single fluid motion. His boots hit the dirt with a sound that seemed to anchor the world. "You hurt?" he asked. His voice was low, like rocks grinding together. Joanna just stared. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face, missing nothing. "You're bleeding." He didn't ask permission, just knelt, pulling a clean cloth from a saddlebag. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he pressed the cloth to her temple. "Tornado?" She could only nod. He stood up, looking back at the direction she'd come from. "Took everything?" Another nod. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he said, "Name's Judson Avery. My cabin's a few miles west. You can ride with me." Joanna found her voice, raw and cracked. "You don't even know my name." He gave a slight shrug, his eyes never leaving hers. "Don't need to. I know what it is to have everything taken away." He offered her a hand. She took it. His grip was firm, solid. He helped her onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his arm a steel band around her waist, and as they rode away from the wreckage, Joanna couldn't shake a strange, cold feeling that settled deep in her gut. He said he knew what it was like to lose everything. But the way he said it didn't sound like a memory. It sounded like a warning. The cabin was small, built to withstand a siege. It was tucked against a low hill almost hidden, with thick walls and a single heavy plank door. It smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old iron. Judson helped her down and led her inside. It was sparse, almost brutally simple. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone hearth. "You take the bed," he said, not looking at her. "I'll take the floor." "I can't stay," she whispered, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. He finally turned, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, seemed to see right through her. "You can stay as long as you need." He didn't push. He just handed her a dipper of cool water and then went about his business, moving with a quiet efficiency that felt practiced. He wasn't just a man living alone. He was a man who knew how to survive alone. That night the nightmares came. The roar of the wind, the splintering wood. She woke up screaming, thrashing in the unfamiliar bed. He was there in an instant, a shadow in the moonlight filtering through the single window. He knelt beside the bed, a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said, his voice the same low rumble as before. "You're safe here." And that was the strange part. She believed him. She turned and buried her face in his coarse wool shirt, and his arms came around her, solid and sure. He didn't say another word, just held her until the shaking stopped and her breathing evened out. He held her like a man holding back a storm. In the morning, she found a plain dress in a wooden trunk. It was clean, mended with small, neat stitches. It fit her perfectly, too perfectly. She braided her hair and went outside. Judson was sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel filling the quiet morning. "Feel like helping me mend a fence?" he asked, not looking up. She nodded. "I'd like that." They worked all day under the vast, empty sky. She handed him nails, held the rails steady while he drove them home. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full. She found herself telling him about her parents, about the farm, about the little life that was now just a memory. He listened, his head cocked slightly, his focus absolute. When she asked about his family, a curtain fell over his face. "Gone a long time," was all he said. And the way he said it, she knew not to ask more. That evening they sat on the small porch as the stars began to prick the velvet black sky. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind all day. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Because nobody else was going to." He looked away toward the dark horizon. "And because I'd hoped someone would do the same for me." His jaw was tight, a muscle flexing along the bone. "You don't talk much," she observed. He glanced at her again, a flicker of something in his eyes. "No," he said, "but I listen real well." Days turned into a week. A routine settled in. She cooked. He worked the land. The cabin began to feel less like a stranger's shelter and more like something else. She never went near the small locked shed behind the cabin. He never mentioned it. One afternoon he came back from a trip to town, a town he never named, and set a pair of sturdy new boots by the door. "They're not pretty," he said gruffly, "but they'll hold up." She stared at them. No one had ever bought her anything so practical, so necessary. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of something that looked like longing. "Because you're here," he said, "and because I want you to stay." That night she didn't have a nightmare. She lay awake, listening to his steady breathing from the floor, and she realized the cabin didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt like a fortress, and she wasn't sure if it was meant to keep the world out or to keep him in. The longer Joanna stayed, the more she noticed the little things, the things that didn't add up. Judson never talked about where he came from, not really. If she asked, he'd give a one-word answer. East or west. It changed. He had a rifle, a big lever action, that was never more than an arm's length away. It was always clean, always loaded. He didn't just own it like a farmer owned a tool. He wore it like a third arm. And then there were the nights he didn't sleep. She'd wake in the deep dark and see his silhouette by the window, staring out into the blackness, perfectly still, for hours. Listening, waiting. But the days were good. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. He taught her how to track, how to read the clouds. She taught him how to make her mother's sourdough starter, and the cabin started to smell like a home. One afternoon they were turning the soil for a small garden. The sun was hot on their backs, and she paused, wiping sweat from her brow. She caught him looking at her, not with desire, but with a kind of intense, painful focus. "What is it?" she asked. He looked away, back at the earth. Didn't expect the quiet to feel better with someone in it. I didn't expect to feel safe again, she confessed. His hands tightened on the handle of the spade. He didn't answer. A few weeks later, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind him like a ghost. Instantly, Judson changed. His whole body went rigid. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. He didn't raise it, but his fingers rested on the stock. He moved so he was standing slightly in front of Joanna. A human shield. The rider wasn't a farmer. He wore a dark coat, despite the heat, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He pulled his horse up a few yards from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over everything. The new fence, the tilled garden. Then his eyes landed on Joanna, a cold, flat gaze that made her skin crawl. "Miss Tucker?" he asked. His voice was thin, reedy. Joanna stepped forward, but Judson put a hand on her arm, a silent command to stay put. "I'm Joanna Tucker," she said. "Sent by your kin in Topeka," the man said, but his eyes flickered to Judson. "They were worried. Your mother's hip was broken in a fall. They asked me to find you, see that you were all right." Relief washed over Joanna, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Her parents would have sent a neighbor, someone she knew, not this vulture in a black coat. "She'll recover," the man added, "but they want you to come home." Judson hadn't moved a muscle. He was staring at the man, his face a mask of stone. It wasn't the concerned gaze of a neighbor. It was a standoff. "I'll write them," Joanna said, her voice stronger than she expected. "But I'm not going back. I've made a life here." The man's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. "Is that so?" He looked from Joanna's determined face to Judson's rigid stance. He looked at the rifle. "Seems you have." He tipped his hat. "I'll pass along the message." He turned his horse and rode away. They watched until he was a tiny speck on the horizon. The moment he was gone, Judson let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. He walked to the edge of the porch, his back to her, and stared out at the empty prairie. "He wasn't from your family, was he?" Joanna asked softly. Judson didn't turn around. His voice was low, dangerous. "No. Who was he?" Finally, he turned to face her. The mask was gone. In its place was a look of such profound weariness, such deep-seated trouble, that it stole her breath. "That," he said, "was a U.S. Marshal. And he wasn't looking for you." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Joanna's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, a U.S. Marshal, here. The man in the black coat hadn't been a messenger of family concern. He'd been a hunter. Judson's eyes were locked on hers, and in their depths she saw a storm that made the tornado look like a summer breeze. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He wasn't looking for me." Joanna's mind raced, trying to piece it together. The rifle that was never out of reach. The nights spent watching from the window. The way he looked at the horizon as if expecting an army to appear. He was hiding. But if the marshal wasn't looking for him, then who? The blood drained from her face as the impossible, terrifying truth hit her. "He was looking for my father," she breathed. Judson's stony expression finally cracked. He took a step toward her, his hands half raised as if to comfort her, then dropped them to his sides. "Joanna? My father is a farmer," she said, her voice shaking. "He's a good man. He builds things. He wouldn't—" The words died in her throat. Her father, a simple, hard-working man. Her mother, devout and kind. It made no sense. It was a lie. It had to be. "Your father's name is John Tucker?" Judson asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Yes." "He ever spend time in Missouri? Before he came here?" Joanna shook her head, bewildered. "No. He was born in Illinois. They moved here right after they were married." She was reciting facts, things she'd known her whole life, but suddenly they felt fragile, like glass. Judson closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, The weariness was back, deeper than before. The marshal is looking for a man named Jedediah Kane, a man who rode with Quantrill's raiders during the war. They burned Lawrence to the ground, killed nearly 200 men and boys. The name meant nothing to her. Lawrence was just a story, a dark chapter in the war that had ended before she was old enough to understand it. What does that have to do with my father? After the war, Judson continued, his voice flat, emotionless. Jedediah Kane vanished, changed his name, started a new life, tried to bury the man he used to be under years of hard work and family. He paused, and the next words landed like hammer blows. The marshal thinks your father is Jedediah Kane. Joanna stared at him, her world tilting on its axis for the second time in as many months. The tornado had destroyed her home. This was destroying her past, her memories, her very identity. "You're lying," she whispered. "Why are you saying this?" "Because," Judson said, and his gaze was filled with a terrible certainty. "I was there. I rode with Quantrill, too." The air left Joanna's lungs in a rush. She stumbled back, hitting the rough wood of the cabin wall. The man who had saved her, the man whose quiet strength had been her anchor, the man she was beginning to feel something for. He was one of them, a killer, a raider. "I was a boy," he said quickly, his voice raw with a pain that was decades old. 16 years old. I followed my older brother into it. I didn't understand what we were doing, not until I saw the smoke over Lawrence, until I heard the screaming. His eyes were haunted, looking at a past she couldn't imagine. "I left that night, deserted. I've been running ever since, from them, from the law, from what I did, from what I saw." He looked at her, his soul seemingly laid bare. "I knew your father's face the second I saw it in a photograph you dropped. It fell out of that book you were reading, the one that survived the storm." She remembered. A small tin-type photo of her parents on their wedding day. She'd found it in the mud, clutched it like a holy relic, and he had seen it. "He was older then," Judson said, "but the eyes, you don't forget the eyes of a man who enjoys the killing." He took a ragged breath. The marshal wasn't just passing through, Joanna. He was circling. He knows Kane is in this territory. He just doesn't know where. That's why he was asking about you. He's looking for the family. He's hunting. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Judson hadn't saved her by chance. He'd seen the wreckage of the Tucker homestead, and he had come looking for her, to warn her, or to use her. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice cold as ice. "When you found me? Did you know who I was?" Judson flinched, as if she'd slapped him. "Yes." The single word was a betrayal sharper than any knife. He hadn't rescued a stranger. He had sought out the daughter of his former comrade in arms. Every kindness, every shared silence, every gentle touch was now tainted. It wasn't about her. It was about her father. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that burned away the fear. "Joanna, you have to listen to me. That marshal, he won't stop. When he finds your father—" "I said get out!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the open prairie. "Take your rifle and your lies and go." He stood there for a long moment, his face a mixture of pain and resignation. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain further. He just gave a slow, sad nod. He turned, picked up his rifle from the porch, and walked away from the cabin without looking back. Joanna stood there, watching him go, her heart a tangled mess of fear, betrayal, and a terrible, aching sorrow. She was alone again, and she had just sent away the only person on earth who knew the truth of the storm that was coming for her family. For days, Joanna existed in a fog of disbelief. She went through the motions of survival, milking the goat, tending the small garden, securing the door at night, but her mind was a whirlwind. Her father, Jedediah Kane, a monster from the war. It was impossible. Her father was the man who taught her to read, who carved her a tiny wooden bird for her 5th birthday. He was gentle. He was kind. Judson was the liar. He had to be. Maybe he was the real Jedediah Kane, trying to pin his past on an innocent man. But the doubt was a poison, seeping into every memory. She remembered her father's sudden, violent rages over small things, a broken tool, a late frost. She'd always thought it was just his way. Now, she saw something else in those flashes of temper. A darkness. She remembered how he never spoke of the war, not once. While other men told stories of battles and bravery, her father would just fall silent, his eyes distant and hard. She found the tintype photo, the one Judson had mentioned. She stared at the young man with the dark, intense eyes standing next to her mother. Was it the face of a killer? She didn't know. She didn't know anything anymore. 1 week after Judson left, she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Not one rider this time. 3. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She slammed the heavy bar across the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. It was the marshal. And with him were 2 other men, grim-faced and armed with repeating rifles. They weren't coming for a friendly chat. They rode straight to the cabin, dismounting with practiced ease. The marshal strode onto the porch and pounded on the door. "Joanna Tucker! This is U.S. Marshal Raines. Open this door." Joanna flattened herself against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We know you're in there!" Raines's voice was sharp, impatient. "We just want to ask you a few questions about your father and about the man who was staying with you, Judson Avery." So they knew about Judson. Had they caught him? Had he told them everything? "We have a warrant for the arrest of Jedediah Kane," Raines shouted. "And another for the deserter, Judson Avery. Aiding and abetting a fugitive is a federal crime, Miss Tucker. Don't make this harder on yourself." Her world was shrinking, the walls of the cabin closing in. Her father was a wanted man. Judson was a wanted man. And she was trapped in the middle. She was a loose end. What would they do to her when they found out she knew everything? "Last chance, Miss Tucker." She heard the click of a rifle hammer being pulled back. They weren't going to wait for an invitation. She scrambled away from the door, looking for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was a box, a trap. Then a voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear from the line of trees at the edge of the clearing. "Leave her alone, Raines." Joanna's head whipped toward the window. It was Judson. He was standing at the edge of the woods, his rifle held loosely at his side, not aiming, but ready. He hadn't run. He had stayed close, watching, waiting, protecting her. Marshal Raines and his deputies spun around, rifles instantly snapping up. "Avery, don't be a fool. There's 3 of us." "And there's 1 of her," Judson called back, his voice calm, steady. "You're not kicking in that door." "I have a warrant for Kane," Raines yelled. "I know he's her father. She knows where he is." "She knows nothing," Judson stated, the words a clear, undeniable command. "She lost everything in the tornado. I found her on the prairie. That's the entire story. Your business is with me. Let her go, and I'll come peaceably." Joanna's breath caught. He was trading himself for her. He was willing to hang to keep her safe. In that moment, all the lies and betrayals fell away. She saw him not as a raider or a deserter, but as the man who held her through her nightmares, the man who bought her boots, the man who was now standing between her and 3 loaded guns. Raines laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think you're in a position to bargain, Avery? We'll take you both. We'll find Kane, and the whole rotten lot of you will swing together." One of the deputies shifted his aim, centering his rifle on Judson's chest. "Just give the word, Marshal." Judson didn't even flinch. He just stood his ground, a lone figure against the wilderness. "The word you give now," Judson said, his voice dropping, carrying a deadly weight, "decides if you ride out of here or get buried here. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And just as the deputy's finger tightened on the trigger, a second voice echoed from a different part of the woods, to the right of the cabin. "He's not alone, Marshal." Everyone froze. A figure stepped out from behind a thick oak tree. He was older, his hair grayed at the temples, his face lined with years of sun and worry. He held an old Sharps buffalo rifle with the ease of long practice. It was her father, John Tucker, or Jedediah Kane. He had come. Marshal Raines stared, his face a mask of shocked triumph. "Kane," he breathed, "after all these years." Joanna's father ignored him. His eyes were on Joanna, who was still peering through the crack in the shutter. His face was filled with a world of regret. "I heard what the tornado did," he called, his voice thick with emotion. "I came as soon as I heard. I'm sorry, Joanna, for everything." Then he turned his gaze back to the marshal, and his face hardened, the gentle farmer disappearing, replaced by a man Joanna had never seen before, a man with eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "You want me, Raines? You got me. But you and your men will put down your guns. You will let my daughter and that boy go. You give me your word." Raines let out another bark of laughter. "You're surrounded, Kane. You're in no position to demand anything." "Look again," her father said calmly. And then, from the rocks above the cabin, from the thick brush along the creek, from the deep shadows of the woods, more figures emerged. 10 of them. 15, men with hard faces and old grudges, armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They weren't farmers. They were ghosts. Ghosts from a bloody war who had tried to bury their pasts on the lonely frontier. Neighbors she'd seen in town, men who tipped their hats, now stood ready for a battle. They had all heard the call. Kane's presence had drawn them out of hiding. Marshal Raines and his deputies were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. They were standing in the middle of a trap surrounded by a small army of the deadliest men the war had ever produced. The marshal's face went pale. He slowly, deliberately lowered his rifle. "All right, Kane," he said, his voice strained. "All right, we'll do it your way." The tension in the clearing was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Marshal Raines and his 2 deputies stood frozen, their rifles now pointed at the ground, a dozen guns aimed at them from the surrounding wilderness. "Joanna?" her father's voice called out, softer now. "It's safe. You can come out." Her hand was shaking so hard she could barely lift the bar on the door. When she stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the harsh sunlight, the scene was surreal. Her father, the man she knew as John Tucker, stood 20 yards away, a rifle in his hands, looking like a king holding court. Judson was still by the tree line, his rifle now held at a low ready, his eyes scanning the deputies, trusting nothing. "Tell your men to stand down, Kane," Raines said, his voice tight. "They're not my men," her father replied. "They're just neighbors, concerned about the law harassing an innocent woman." The other men didn't smile, their faces grim. "Joanna," her father said, his eyes finding hers again. "This man," he nodded toward Judson. "He's Judson Avery?" "Yes," she whispered. "He was just a boy back then, a good boy in a bad war. He ran the first chance he got. He's not the man you're looking for, Raines. His only crime was knowing my face." "He deserted," Raines spat. "He's a fugitive. We were all a lot of things back then," her father said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "The war is over. It has been for a long time. You're hunting ghosts." "The law has a long memory," the marshal shot back. "Then it should also remember justice," her father said. He took a step forward, lowering his own rifle and leaning it against a tree, an act of trust or a calculated risk. "I'll make you a deal, Marshal. You want Jedediah Kane. You've got him. I'll ride with you. No tricks, no trouble. In exchange, you give my daughter and Avery a signed pardon. You write it out, right here, right now, stating they are cleared of all crimes, real or imagined. You will put an end to this hunt, for both of them, forever." Raines stared, incredulous. I don't have that authority. You're a U.S. Marshal, Kane countered. You can write a field deposition. You can sign it. I know for a fact it'll be honored. Your word in front of these witnesses. He gestured to the silent men in the woods. Or we can settle this a different way. And nobody rides home. The marshal was trapped. He looked at the faces in the trees, men who looked like they had nothing left to lose. He looked at Kane, who stood before him, unarmed, but radiating an authority more powerful than any weapon. He looked at Judson, whose steady gaze promised a bloody end if he made the wrong move. Finally, he nodded, his jaw tight with anger and defeat. Get me a pen and paper. Joanna watched in a daze as one of the deputies retrieved a satchel from his horse. The marshal wrote out 2 short documents on a piece of parchment, his movements stiff and angry. He signed them both with a flourish. There, he said, holding them out. Pardons for Joanna Tucker and Judson Avery, free and clear. Give them to my daughter, Kane commanded. The marshal walked slowly toward the porch and handed the papers to Joanna. Her fingers brushed against his hand was cold and clammy. She looked at the documents. Her name. Judson's name. Signed and sealed. It was real. It was over. Her father looked at her, one last time. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, a lifetime of apologies, but there was no time. Be happy, Joanna, he said, his voice cracking. Build something that lasts. Then he turned to Judson. You take care of her. You hear me? You protect her. I will, Judson said, his voice low and certain. John Tucker, Jedediah Kane, turned and walked toward the marshal's horses. He didn't look back. He swung into the saddle, a prisoner by choice, trading his freedom for his daughter's future. Raines and his deputies mounted up, and without another word they rode away, taking the ghost of Jedediah Kane with them. As they disappeared over the rise, the men began to melt back into the trees, their duty done. Soon it was just Joanna and Judson, standing in the quiet clearing, the 2 pardons clutched in her hand. She looked at him, really looked at him. The lies, the secrets, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what he had done. He had come back. He had been willing to die for her. Why? She whispered, her throat tight. Why would you do that for me? Judson finally walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. The weariness was still in his eyes, but there was something else now, too. Something soft and hopeful. Because, he said, his voice quiet but clear in the sudden stillness. From the moment I first saw you sitting in the dirt, all alone with the whole world broken around you, I knew my running was over. He took a deep breath, the first easy one he seemed to have taken in his life. I wasn't just saving you, Joanna. You were saving me. Tears she hadn't shed for her home, for her past, now streamed down her face. Tears of grief, of relief, of a fragile, terrifying hope. She didn't say a word. She just closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. His arms came around her, holding her tight, and this time, it wasn't just to keep the nightmares at bay. It was a promise, a beginning. In the quiet aftermath, they stood together on the porch of the small, rugged cabin that had become the unlikely center of their world. The prairie was silent again, the ghosts of the past having finally ridden away. Joanna held the pardons in her hand, the paper still warm. They were more than just legal documents. They were a foundation, a plot of clear land on which they could build. He's really gone, she said softly, staring at the empty horizon. He did it to save you, Judson said, his voice a low rumble beside her. He spent 20 years building a life to escape who he was. In the end, he gave up that life to protect what he'd built. A strange peace settled over Joanna. Her father was a killer, a raider, but he was also the man who had faced down a marshal and a posse to give her a future. The 2 truths were impossible to reconcile, so she decided to let them be. She would mourn the father she'd lost and honor the sacrifice the stranger had made. She turned to Judson. "And you? Your running is really over?" He met her gaze, his winter sky eyes clear and steady. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." He looked around at the small cabin, the tilled garden, the mended fence. "This is more of a home than I've ever had." "It's not much," she said. "It's everything," he replied. That night, they didn't speak of the past. They didn't need to. It had been faced, and it had been defeated. Instead, they sat at the small table he had built, and by the light of a single kerosene lamp, they made plans. They spoke of the coming winter, of needing to lay in more firewood. They talked about getting more seed in the spring, perhaps for wheat. They spoke of the future, not as a distant, uncertain thing, but as something they would build together, day by day, rail by rail. When they went to bed, she didn't hesitate. She lay down beside him, and his arm came around her, pulling her close. It felt right. It felt safe. For the first time, the silence of the cabin wasn't full of secrets and unspoken fears. It was full of peace. Spring came, and with it, life. The garden thrived. Joanna planted the wheat seeds Judson had bought, and soon, pale green shoots pushed their way through the dark soil. They worked side by side, falling into a comfortable rhythm. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. A shared glance, a small nod, a hand brushing against another was enough. One day, their Norwegian neighbor, Haver, rode over with his daughter, Marta. He brought them a crate of jars for canning, and his wife sent a loaf of sweet bread. Marta, young and curious, looked from Judson's strong frame to Joanna's quiet competence. "Must be good having help," she commented. Joanna smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "He doesn't help," she said, looking at Judson. "We build things together." Judson, who was checking a harness nearby, looked over and a slow smile spread across his own face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed him. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a simple, unburdened warmth. As the months passed, the cabin changed. Joanna stitched curtains from old flour sacks. Judson built a proper washboard by the creek so she wouldn't have to haul the water. They were small things, but they were acts of love, of permanence. They were building a life. One evening, as a summer storm rumbled in the distance, they sat on the porch. Joanna leaned her head against his shoulder. "You ever think about children?" she asked quietly. Judson was still for a moment, then his hand came to rest on her hip. "I've thought of it more lately. Would you want to raise them here? In this place?" He pulled her a little closer, his calloused thumb rubbing gentle circles on her arm. "If they had your steadiness," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and didn't mind dirt under their nails, I'd raise a dozen." Joanna smiled and turned her face up to his. "Let's start with one." He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that wasn't about passion or desperation, but about a deep, abiding peace, a promise of a future built not on running from the past, but on planting roots so deep that no storm could ever tear them out again. The following summer, the cry of a newborn baby filled the small cabin, a sound of pure, untainted life. They named her Clara. She had Joanna's steady gaze, and as she grew, Judson's quiet strength. Judson would hold her for hours, humming tuneless songs, a look of absolute wonder on his face. He was no longer the haunted man Joanna had met on the prairie. He was a husband, a father. He was home. Years passed. The cabin was expanded, a new room added for Clara. The wheat field grew, and their small homestead became a landmark of resilience on the vast prairie. They never received word of what happened to Jedediah Kane, and they never sought it. His story had ended the day he rode away, sacrificing himself for theirs. Their life wasn't easy, but it was good. It was real. They had faced down the ghosts of the past, the violence of the sky, and the judgment of the law, and they had won. They had built something that would last. And sometimes, on a quiet evening, Joanna would stand on the porch with Judson's arm around her and Clara playing in the yard, and she would look out at the endless expanse of the prairie. She had once stood in its wreckage, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she stood in the center of her entire world, a world she hadn't found, but one she had built, hand in hand with the man who had stopped running to build it with her. It's amazing what can grow from the ashes, isn't it? What looks like an ending can sometimes be the most beautiful, unexpected beginning. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we have so many more incredible stories just like it coming your way.